morning, good evening, and good afternoon to you all. From those down the road to the folks around the world. Welcome back to another video, this week talking about the later years of the township of Stuart, later called Alice Springs, in the centre of Australia. But if you missed last week's video, you can either check this little link up in the corner here, or you can listen to me blither on for the next 30 seconds to a minute as I recap the story. In 1862, the famous explorer John McDowell Stuart passes through the centre of Australia, trying to get to the northern coastline. But it isn't until 1871, when a man called William Mills, working as a surveyor for the Overland Telegraph Network, he discovers the water source, the Alice Spring, which is attached to the Todd River. But it's not an actual water spring, it's more of a water depression inside the riverbed. The Overland Telegraph Network set up a communication station next to this Alice Spring, this water source. And over the next 20 years, more and more people start to work there, more and more buildings set up, and with the discovery of gold in the late 1880s, that's when the population starts to swell too much. So the settlement of Stuart is then constructed in 1888. But in the early 20th century, things started to become more permanent, and there were more people deciding to stay longer and build lives in the township of Stuart. And so with that, the population increased, and more permanent buildings, major buildings, were needed and constructed to service this new ever-growing population. The first major building to be constructed was the Stuart Gaol, the prison, with an attached police station, in about 1907, constructed out of local stone. Perhaps it was rather an odd choice for a first building, considering that an administrative building was probably more so required. The gaol was used until about 1938, because somehow the gaol had managed to become in the dead centre of this township of now Alice Springs. And it was felt that, well, it's rather inappropriate to have a gaol right in the centre of the town. What message does that send? So, as I say, it was closed in 1938 and a new prison was constructed on the outskirts of town. A proper administrative building wasn't constructed until about 20 years later in 1928, and now called the Residency. It was built because Alice Springs was made the capital of the Central Australian state, a short-lived state that only ran between 1927 and 1931. It was deemed in the mid-20s, just before then, that the Northern Territory was far too large to administrate from in Darwin, so it was split in two, the Northern State and the Central State. But due to various reasons, which I won't go into too much detail about, it was conjoined back again in 1931. And the Residency, well, that became a more local administrative building instead of a statewide admin building. When planes started to land in Alice Springs in the early 1920s, it was realised that actually this central settlement has brilliant access to other areas across Australia, across the centre of Australia especially. Other isolated settlements that had sprung up in the late 19th and early 20th century, but also the pastoralist stations that had been springing up as well since the 1880s. In 1926, a man by the name of John Flynn set up the Royal Flying Doctors, a medical facility on a plane that could easily fly to these isolated settlements and pastoralist stations and give them medical care, especially in grave emergencies. And roughly around the same time as the establishment of the Royal Flying Doctors was the major construction of the first central hospital. And that building too was also constructed under the guidance of John Flynn and his Christian organisation AIM, stands for Australian Inland Mission. Now this mission wasn't to construct churches like many other missions across the world, but it was to construct a number of hospitals to benefit the people that were living in Central Australia, the people that were living in the bush. These hospitals had a unique structure and were designed specifically to be adapted to the Australian climate. Now, these hospitals would have cellars in them, but not for storing food or perhaps even the communion wine, but as an early form of an air conditioning system. If you take a look at this poorly drawn diagram of the hospital, what would have happened was that the air would have passed through these filters, the hot air passing through the filters into the cellar. Inside the cellar would be small bags filled with water, not only to cool the actual air itself, but also to catch any of the dust that might have filtered through as well. Once cooled, it would then be able to pass through these filters and create a nice cool system into the hospital. AIM may have been a Christian organisation dedicated to the spiritual well-being of the Central Australian people, but like with the track record of building hospitals instead of churches, it was about more than just spiritual well-being. It was about the physical well-being of the people that were living in Central Australia. More books and magazines were passed out than there were Bibles. More nurses were being employed than there were ministers of the faith. It may have been a Christian organisation, but it had a wider purpose than just its Christian origins. In 1929, a new train station was being established in the township. So what would take a few weeks by camel or by horse would now take just a few days. Now, all this development and expansion with railways, airport facilities, and even the major buildings would come to be greatly utilised during the Second World War. With the bombing of Darwin in February of 1942, many of the civilians were evacuated from the city down south, and many of them stayed in Alice Springs. The civilian administration, based again in Darwin, was moved down to Alice Springs also. So for a long time during the Second World War, Alice Springs became the administrative capital of the Northern Territory. And with American troops being stationed in Australia throughout the Second World War, some 200,000 troops would pass through the streets of Alice Springs between 1940 and 1944, including the lead, Douglas MacArthur. And there we have it, Alice Springs. Not just a tourist hotspot where hundreds come to stay in order to visit that big famous rock. It is much more than that. It has its own rich and fulfilling history. I hope you have enjoyed today's video, and I hope that you continue to enjoy these videos still. If you haven't seen previous weeks, please do check out this little corner here or go down to the page down below. But until next week's video, I shall wish you all a great day. See you later.